Sometimes the most devastating betrayals come wrapped in love's disguise. When trust shatters, it doesn't just break. It transforms the broken into something unrecognizable. This is the story of a woman who learned that family loyalty has its limits, that forgiveness has its boundaries, and that sometimes the only way to reclaim your power is to become someone they never saw coming. What started with a burning jacket would ignite a war that would consume everything in its path, because when you push someone past their breaking point, you don't just lose them, you create your worst enemy. Sarah Martinez had always been the peacekeeper in her family. At 32, she was the middle child who smoothed over arguments, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who organized family gatherings and made sure everyone felt included. Her small apartment in downtown Phoenix was modest but warm, filled with photographs of family memories and handmade gifts from relatives who had long since stopped making time for her. The leather jacket hanging in her closet was more than just clothing. It was a piece of her father's memory, worn and weathered from his years as a motorcycle mechanic. When he passed away 5 years earlier, it was the only thing Sarah had asked for from his belongings. Her older brother Marcus had inherited the house. Her younger sister Elena got the car. But Sarah wanted only that jacket. It smelled like motor oil and Old Spice cologne, and on difficult days she would hold it close and remember his rough hands teaching her how to change a tire, his patient voice explaining why honesty mattered more than being right. Sarah worked as a social worker at the county office, a job that paid little but meant everything to her. She specialized in helping families navigate crisis situations, and her colleagues often marveled at her ability to remain calm under pressure. What they didn't know was that her own family had provided years of training in managing dysfunction. Her mother, Carmen, had remarried 3 years after her father's death. Robert Henley was everything her father wasn't: wealthy, controlling, and utterly convinced that his money gave him the right to reshape the Martinez family according to his vision. He owned several car dealerships across Arizona and spoke often about building a family empire. The problem was that Sarah didn't fit into his plans. Marcus had embraced Robert quickly. The promise of managing one of the dealerships had been enough to secure his loyalty. Elena, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and substantial student debt, had been equally receptive to Robert's offers of employment and financial stability. But Sarah, with her social work degree and her insistence on helping people rather than selling them cars, was seen as an obstacle to family unity. The friction had been building for months. Family dinners became battlegrounds where Robert would lecture Sarah about wasting her education on ungrateful people who would never appreciate her sacrifice. Her mother would sit silently, picking at her food while Robert questioned Sarah's life choices with the confidence of a man who believed money was the ultimate measure of success. The breaking point came on a Sunday in October. Sarah had been invited to what she thought was a family barbecue at her mother's house. She arrived wearing her father's jacket, as she often did during cooler weather. The familiar weight of it across her shoulders provided comfort as she walked up the driveway, carrying a homemade potato salad and hoping for a peaceful afternoon. Instead, she found her family arranged in the living room with the formality of a business meeting. Robert sat behind her father's old desk, which he had moved from the garage into the house and claimed as his own. Marcus and Elena flanked him like lieutenants, while her mother sat apart, wringing her hands and avoiding eye contact. "Sarah, we need to talk," Robert announced before she had even set down the potato salad. "This family is moving forward, but you're holding us back." The conversation that followed was brutal in its calculated cruelty. Robert laid out his vision for the Martinez family brand, explaining how each member would contribute to building something lasting and profitable. He spoke about legacy and unity, about the importance of presenting a cohesive image to the community. Sarah listened in growing disbelief as her own family members nodded along to his plan to reshape their identity. "The problem," Robert continued, his voice taking on the tone he might use with a difficult customer, "is that you refuse to be part of something bigger than yourself. Your job is admirable, I suppose, but it's not building anything. It's not contributing to the family's future." Sarah found her voice finally. "Dad always said that helping people was the most important thing you could do with your life." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's expression hardened, and Sarah saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "Your father," he said slowly, "is dead." And his way of thinking died with him. It's time this family stopped living in the past. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She looked around the room, searching for support from the people who had shared her father's love, who had grown up with his values. Marcus was studying his hands. Elena was scrolling through her phone. Her mother was crying quietly, but making no move to defend her late husband's memory. "I think," Robert continued, his voice gaining momentum, "that we need to make a clean break from old influences. Start fresh. Build something new. That's when Sarah noticed that her family members were each holding something. Marcus had an old baseball mitt that had belonged to their father. Elena held a faded band t-shirt from their father's youth. Her mother clutched a wedding ring on a chain around her neck. "We're going to have a little ceremony," Robert announced, producing a metal trash can from behind the desk. "A symbolic letting go of the past so we can embrace the future." Sarah watched in horror as, one by one, her family members dropped their mementos into the can. Marcus went first, his jaw set in grim determination. Elena followed, her hands shaking slightly as she released the shirt. Finally, their mother approached, tears streaming down her face as she removed the chain from her neck and let the ring fall into the growing pile. "Now you, Sarah," Robert said, his smile cold and expectant. "The jacket." Sarah clutched the leather closer to her chest. "No, Sarah." Her mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Please, for the family." "This is insane," Sarah said, looking around the room at faces that suddenly seemed like strangers. "You're asking me to throw away the last piece of dad I have?" "We're asking you to choose," Robert replied. "The past or your family's future. You can't have both." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke. Sarah realized that this wasn't really about the jacket at all. It was about power, about Robert's need to erase any influence that challenged his authority over the family he had purchased with promises and financial security. "If I don't?" Sarah asked quietly. Robert's smile grew wider. "Then you're making it clear that you're not really part of this family anymore." Sarah looked at each person in the room, searching for any sign that someone would stand with her. Her mother's tears had stopped, replaced by a resigned acceptance that broke Sarah's heart. Marcus and Elena had already made their choices, their silence speaking louder than any words could.
"I won't do it,"
Sarah said, her voice growing stronger.
"I won't burn Dad's memory to make you comfortable."
Robert nodded as if he had expected this response. "Then I think you should leave." "Mom?" Sarah turned to her mother one last time, hoping for a miracle that didn't come. Carmen Martinez looked at her daughter with eyes full of pain and said the words that would haunt Sarah forever.
"Maybe it's better if you go." Sarah walked to the door, her father's jacket heavy on her shoulders, her potato salad forgotten on the counter.
As she reached for the handle, she heard Robert's voice behind her. "If you change your mind, Sarah, you know where to find us." But the offer won't stand forever. She left without another word, driving home through streets that suddenly felt foreign. In her apartment, she sat on her couch and tried to process what had just happened. Her family had given her a choice between her father's memory and their acceptance, and she had chosen memory. Now she was alone with the consequences. That night, Sarah called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. She spent the day walking through her neighborhood, wearing her father's jacket, and trying to understand how love could be conditional, how family could become something you had to earn through surrender. She thought about calling them, about going back and throwing the jacket into Robert's fire if it meant she could sit at her mother's table again. But every time she reached for her phone, she heard her father's voice reminding her that some things were worth fighting for, even if you had to fight alone. The jacket hung in her closet that night, unchanged and unmoved. But Sarah herself had been transformed by the day's events. The woman who had spent her life keeping peace had discovered that some wars were worth fighting, and some bridges were meant to burn. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't go back begging for acceptance. She wouldn't compromise her father's memory for their comfort. Instead, she would show them exactly what they had lost when they chose to throw her away. The peacekeeper was dead. What emerged in her place would be something her family had never seen before, something they wouldn't recognize until it was far too late to undo what they had done. In the darkness of her bedroom, Sarah Martinez began planning her transformation. They had wanted her to destroy the past. Instead, she would use it to build a future they could never have imagined, a future where their choices would come back to haunt them in ways they never saw coming. 3 months passed without a single word from her family. Sarah threw herself into her work with an intensity that surprised even her colleagues. She took on extra cases, worked weekends, and volunteered for the assignments that others avoided. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, noticed the change immediately.
"You're burning yourself out," Janet warned during a Monday morning meeting.
"When's the last time you took a vacation?" Sarah looked up from the stack of files she was reviewing. "I'm fine. Just focused." But fine was a relative term. Sarah had discovered that anger, properly channeled, could be incredibly productive. The fury that burned in her chest had become fuel for transformation. She enrolled in evening classes at the community college, studying business administration and computer forensics. She learned about corporate structure, financial investigation, and data recovery. Knowledge, she realized, was the most powerful weapon she could acquire. Her small apartment became a command center. She set up a desk in her bedroom where she studied, late into the night, surrounding herself with textbooks on accounting, law enforcement procedures, and private investigation techniques. The leather jacket hung on the back of her chair like a reminder of what she was fighting for. The first sign that her family's perfect new life wasn't so perfect came through an old college friend who worked at a local newspaper. Jenny Reeves had always been a gossip, but her information was usually reliable. She called Sarah on a Tuesday evening in January. "I don't know if you care," Jenny said after they had exchanged pleasantries, "but there's some weird stuff happening with your stepfather's business." Sarah set down the forensics textbook she had been reading. "What kind of weird stuff?" "The kind that involves late-night meetings with people who don't look like car buyers. My boyfriend works security at the office building where Henley has his main office. He says there's been a lot of activity after hours, and not the kind you'd expect from someone selling sedans." Sarah thanked Jenny for the information and hung up, her mind already working. She had learned enough about financial investigations to know that legitimate businesses don't require secret meetings. She also knew that Robert Henley's rapid expansion in the car industry had raised eyebrows among people who understood how dealership networks actually worked. That weekend, Sarah drove past each of Robert's dealership locations, not to spy exactly, but to observe. What she saw was interesting. The lots were full of cars, but there weren't many customers. The showrooms looked busy from the outside, but when she walked through as a potential buyer, she noticed things that didn't make sense. Sales staff who seemed more interested in her personal information than her car preferences. Service departments that were closed despite posted hours. Computer systems that looked more sophisticated than what most car dealers would need. Sarah's social work training had taught her to notice patterns, and the pattern here was concerning. She began documenting what she observed, taking photos and keeping detailed notes. It was just curiosity at first, but curiosity had a way of becoming investigation when you knew what to look for. Her breakthrough came through an unlikely source. Mrs. Chen, one of her elderly clients, mentioned that her grandson had gotten a job at one of Robert's dealerships. The young man was excited about the work, but confused about his duties. "He says they have him moving cars around a lot," Mrs. Chen explained during their weekly visit. "But not to customers, just from one lot to another, then back again. He doesn't understand why, but the pay is good, so he doesn't ask questions." Sarah felt the familiar tingle that came when a case started to break open. Car movement without sales could indicate several things, none of them good. She encouraged Mrs. Barber Chen to have her grandson keep track of his duties, just in case he ever needed to explain his work experience to future employers. Meanwhile, her family's silence continued. Sarah's birthday came and went without acknowledgement. She spent the day at the library, researching money laundering techniques and automotive fraud. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was learning more about her family's business than they'd probably realized she could. Her mother's birthday was harder. Sarah sat in her car outside the old house for an hour, watching people she didn't recognize come and go. The house itself looked different, more expensive, but somehow colder. New landscaping had erased the garden where her father had taught her to grow tomatoes. The garage, where he had worked on neighbors' cars for free, had been converted into something that looked like a home office. As she was about to drive away, she saw Elena leaving the house. Her sister looked polished in a way that seemed artificial, wearing expensive clothes and carrying a designer bag that cost more than Sarah made in 2 months. But there was something else in Elena's expression, something that looked like regret or maybe fear. Sarah rolled down her window as Elena walked to her car. "Elena." Her sister froze, then turned slowly. For a moment, Sarah thought Elena might actually talk to her, might bridge the gap that had opened between them. Instead, Elena's expression hardened into the same cold mask that Robert wore. "You shouldn't be here," Elena said quietly. "It's Mom's birthday. She's not your mom anymore. You made your choice." The cruelty of the words was stunning, even after months of silence. Sarah watched her sister drive away and realized that the people she had loved were truly gone, replaced by strangers who looked like her family but spoke with Robert's voice. That night, Sarah called her father's old friend, Detective Mike Torino. Mike had retired from the Phoenix Police Department 2 years earlier, but still worked as a private investigator. Sarah had helped his daughter navigate a custody dispute through the county system, and he owed her a favor. "I need some advice," Sarah said after they had caught up. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to investigate a business for financial irregularities, what would they need to know? Mike was quiet for a long moment. Hypothetically, that someone would need to be very careful. Financial crimes investigations can be dangerous, especially if the wrong people are involved. Why do you ask? Sarah told him about Robert's business practices, about the strange patterns she had observed, about the late-night meetings and the car movements that made no sense. Mike listened without interruption, and when she finished, he sighed heavily. Sarah, I'm going to give you some advice as someone who cares about you. Stay away from this. If Robert Henley is involved in money laundering or fraud, he's not working alone. These operations usually have protection, and that protection doesn't like people asking questions. But what if I'm right? What if he's using my family as cover for criminal activity? Then the FBI will figure it out eventually. Your job is to stay safe and stay out of the way, but Mike's warning only strengthened Sarah's resolve. If Robert was using her family as unwitting accomplices in criminal activity, they deserved to know. And if they were willing accomplices, they deserved whatever consequences came with their choices. She decided to dig deeper, but more carefully. Using techniques she had learned in her computer forensics class, Sarah began researching Robert's financial history. Public records showed a pattern of rapid business growth that didn't match typical market expansion. Property purchases that seemed designed to move money rather than generate profit. Business partnerships with companies that existed only on paper. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Robert Henley was running a sophisticated money laundering operation through his dealership network. The cars were just props in a much larger scheme, and her family members were either complicit or being used as legitimate-looking front people. Sarah's apartment filled with charts and timelines, photographs and financial documents. She worked with the methodical patience her father had taught her when they fixed engines together. Every piece had to fit perfectly, or the whole machine would break down. As winter turned to spring, Sarah's investigation expanded. She learned that Robert had connections to businesses in several states, all following similar patterns. She documented suspicious transactions, unusual staffing patterns, and business practices that violated standard dealership protocols. She was building a case that would be impossible to ignore, even if she had to present it anonymously. But as her evidence grew stronger, so did the danger. Sarah began noticing cars that seemed to follow her home from work. Her phone received hang-up calls at odd hours. Someone had gone through her mail, leaving it slightly disheveled in a way that was clearly intentional. The message was clear. Someone knew what she was doing and they wanted her to stop. Instead of backing down, Sarah accelerated her timeline. She made copies of everything, storing evidence in multiple locations. She prepared detailed reports that could be understood by law enforcement agencies. She documented every threat and every suspicious incident, building a case not just against Robert's business practices, but against the intimidation campaign that was trying to silence her. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen's grandson had been keeping track of his duties at Robert's dealership, just as Sarah had suggested. The young man had noticed that certain cars were moved multiple times per day, always between the same 3 locations, and always without any paperwork. When he asked his supervisor about the procedure, he was told to mind his own business and given a significant raise. Sarah knew that this pattern was classic money laundering behavior. The cars were being used to justify financial transactions that had nothing to do with legitimate sales. The constant movement created paper trails that would confuse auditors and make it difficult to track the actual flow of money through the business. She also knew that she now had enough evidence to bring down Robert's entire operation. The question was what to do with that power. Sarah sat in her apartment one evening in May, surrounded by months of careful investigation, wearing her father's leather jacket as she had every night since the confrontation with her family. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to turn her evidence over to the authorities immediately or to give her family one chance to extract themselves from Robert's criminal enterprise. Either way, the woman who had been thrown away like an old jacket was about to show them exactly what they had lost. And this time, she wouldn't be asking for their acceptance. She would be demanding their accountability. The transformation was complete by June. Sarah had spent 8 months rebuilding herself from the inside out, and the woman who emerged bore little resemblance to the peacekeeper her family had dismissed. She had lost 20 pounds through stress and determination, her soft features sharpened by months of anger and focus. Her wardrobe had evolved from the comfortable clothes of a social worker to the sharp, professional attire of someone who meant business. More importantly, Sarah had armed herself with knowledge and connections that made her dangerous in ways her family could never have imagined. Through her computer forensics courses, she had met retired federal agents who now worked in private security. Through her investigation, she had developed relationships with journalists who specialized in financial crimes. Through her methodical documentation, she had built a case that would destroy everything Robert had constructed. The intimidation campaign had intensified as her investigation progressed. Sarah's car had been vandalized twice, both incidents careful enough to avoid security cameras, but obvious enough to send a message. Her apartment had been broken into. Nothing stolen, but everything slightly out of place in a way that made it clear someone had been searching for her files. The hang-up calls had become more frequent, often coming at 3 in the morning to disrupt her sleep. But Sarah had learned to turn fear into fuel. Every threat made her more determined. Every attempt at intimidation strengthened her resolve. She had installed security cameras in her apartment, changed her locks 3 times, and begun carrying pepper spray. More importantly, she had arranged for her evidence to be automatically released to law enforcement and media contacts if anything happened to her. She was no longer just investigating Robert's crimes. She was protecting herself from the consequences of that investigation. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in late June. Sarah was leaving the county office after a particularly difficult day when she noticed a familiar car in the parking lot. Marcus was sitting behind the wheel, looking older and more tired than she remembered. When their eyes met through the windshield, he got out and approached her with hesitant steps. "Sarah, we need to talk." She hadn't heard his voice in 8 months, and the sound of it brought back a flood of memories from their childhood. Marcus teaching her to ride a bike, helping her with homework, defending her from schoolyard bullies. For a moment, she almost forgot the man who had stood silently while Robert demanded she burn their father's memory. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," she said, maintaining the professional distance she had learned to project. "It's about Mum," Marcus said quickly. "She's in the hospital." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Despite everything that had happened, Carmen Martinez was still her mother, and the thought of losing her brought back all the pain Sarah had spent months trying to bury. "What happened?" "She collapsed at work yesterday. Stress, the doctors think. Maybe a mild heart attack. She's been asking for you." Sarah studied her brother's face, looking for signs of deception. Marcus had always been a terrible liar, wearing his emotions too openly to be convincing. What she saw now wasn't manipulation but genuine worry and something that might have been shame. "Where is she?" Phoenix General. "Room 314. Sarah, I know things have been complicated, but she needs her family right now." The word family hung between them like a challenge. Sarah wondered if Marcus understood the irony of using that term after 8 months of silence. After standing by while she was exiled from the very family he was now invoking. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Marcus nodded and started to walk away, then turned back. "Sarah, there are things you don't understand about the situation with Robert. Things that are more complicated than you know." "What kind of things?" But Marcus just shook his head and got back in his car, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, weighing her options. Her investigation had revealed that Robert's money laundering operation was far more extensive than she had initially realized. The dealership network was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that included real estate fraud, tax evasion, and possible connections to organized crime. If her family members were involved, they were in serious legal jeopardy. If they weren't involved, they were in physical danger. If simply by association. Either way, seeing her mother in the hospital felt like walking into a trap. But Sarah had spent months learning to calculate risks, and she decided that this was one worth taking. She gathered copies of her most damaging evidence, stored them in a security deposit box, and sent detailed instructions to her media contacts about what to do if she didn't check in within 24 hours. Then she put on her father's leather jacket and drove to Phoenix General Hospital. Carmen Martinez looked smaller in the hospital bed, her skin pale against the white sheets, and her hair streaked with grey that Sarah didn't remember. Machines beeped softly around her, monitoring vital signs that seemed too fragile for someone who had once been strong enough to raise 3 children alone while working. 2 jobs. "Mija," her mother whispered when Sarah entered the room. "You came." The Spanish endearment hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. It had been months since anyone had called her daughter, months since she had felt like someone's child instead of just another caseworker processing other people's problems. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Tired," Carmen admitted. "So tired of everything." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the years of separation temporarily forgotten in the face of medical crisis. Finally, Carmen reached for Sarah's hand. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I'm sorry for choosing him over you. I'm sorry for letting fear make my decisions. I'm sorry for failing you when you needed me most. The apology Sarah had dreamed of hearing felt hollow now that it came so late. Too much had happened. Too much had been discovered. Too many bridges had been burned. Why now, Mom? Why are you sorry now? Carmen's eyes filled with tears. Because I know what he is now. What he's really been doing. And I know what it's going to cost all of us. Sarah felt her investigative instincts sharpen. What do you mean? He's been using the dealerships to wash money for some very dangerous people. Marcus and Elena don't know the full extent of it, but they're involved enough to go to prison if this comes out. And it's going to come out, Sarah. The FBI has been asking questions. They've been watching the business for weeks. The confirmation of Sarah's suspicions brought no satisfaction, only a cold understanding of how completely her family had been compromised. How long have you known? I started suspecting about 6 months ago. The amounts of cash he was bringing home didn't match the reported sales. The phone calls at all hours, the people who came to the house who definitely weren't car buyers. Carmen squeezed Sarah's hand weakly. But I was afraid to ask questions, afraid of what would happen if I made him angry. Sarah thought about the intimidation campaign she had endured, the threats and break-ins that had accompanied her investigation. If Robert was willing to terrorize her for asking questions, what would he do to family members who actually knew his secrets? Where is he now? I don't know. He disappeared 3 days ago, right after I collapsed. Left a note saying he had business to handle out of state. Marcus and Elena are running the dealerships, but they don't know what they're really managing. Sarah realized that her family's situation was even worse than she had imagined. They weren't just complicit in Robert's crimes. They were potential witnesses who could implicate him in federal charges. If Robert's criminal associates believed that Marcus and Elena knew enough to damage their operation, they were in immediate physical danger. Mom, you need to call the FBI. All of you need to cooperate fully and hope they can offer protection in exchange for testimony. Carmen shook her head weakly. Robert said if anyone ever talked to law enforcement, he had enough evidence planted to make sure we all went to prison. He said he had insurance policies that would destroy us if we betrayed him. Sarah understood now why her mother had looked so tired, why Marcus had seemed so worried in the parking lot. They were trapped between federal investigation and criminal retribution, with no safe path forward. Except that Sarah had spent 8 months preparing for exactly this scenario. Mum, what if I told you there was another way? What if someone had already gathered enough evidence to bring down Robert's entire operation without requiring testimony from any of you? Carmen's eyes widened. What do you mean? Sarah pulled out her phone and showed her mother photographs from her investigation. Financial records of proved money laundering. Surveillance photos that documented illegal meetings. Business documents that revealed the scope of Robert's criminal network. I've been investigating him since the day you asked me to leave. I know about the car movements, the fake transactions, the shell companies, the out-of-state connections. I have enough evidence to put him away for 20 years without any of you having to testify. Carmen stared at the photos in amazement. How did you get all this? I learned, Sarah said simply. I learned how to investigate financial crimes. I learned how to gather evidence. I learned how to protect myself and the people I care about. I learned everything I needed to know to bring down the man who tried to destroy our family. For the first time in months, Carmen smiled. Your father would be so proud. I did it for him, Sarah admitted. And I did it for all of you, even after you threw me away. Because family isn't something you can turn on and off like a light switch, no matter how much it hurts. Carmen began to cry, deep sobs that seemed to release months of accumulated fear and guilt. Sarah held her mother's hand and let her cry, understanding that this was the moment their relationship would either heal or break forever. When the tears stopped, Carmen looked at her daughter with clear eyes. What happens now? Sarah checked her watch. It was almost 8 o'clock, and visiting hours would end soon. She needed to move quickly to put her plan into action before Robert realized how exposed he had become. Now we save the family, she said, standing up and adjusting her father's leather jacket. But first, I need to make some phone calls. Sarah left the hospital with a sense of purpose that had been building for 8 months. Her mother's confession had confirmed what her investigation had suggested. Her family was trapped in a criminal enterprise that could destroy them all, but unlike her mother, Marcus and Elena, Sarah had prepared for this moment. She had built an escape route, not just for herself, but for all of them. Her first call was to Detective Mike Torino. Despite his earlier warnings about staying away from the investigation, Mike had continued to provide informal advice as Sarah's evidence mounted. Now she needed his help, to coordinate a surrender that would protect her family while ensuring Robert's arrest. Mike, it's Sarah. I need to cash in that favor. What do you need? I need you to arrange a meeting with the FBI agents who are investigating Robert Henley. My family wants to cooperate, but they need guarantees of protection and immunity in exchange for the evidence I've gathered." Mike was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, you're talking about federal charges. Money laundering, racketeering, possibly organized crime connections. This isn't something you can handle through informal channels." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah replied. "I've been building this case for 8 months. I have financial records, surveillance evidence, witness statements, and documentation of criminal activity that spans multiple states. What I need now is an agent who's smart enough to recognize that I'm handing them a complete case in exchange for protection for people who were manipulated and threatened into silence." "You sure about this? Once you start this process, there's no going back." Sarah looked at herself in her car's rearview mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable from the social worker who had been exiled from her family 8 months earlier. This woman had sharp eyes, a determined jaw, and the confidence of someone who had learned to weaponize knowledge. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Mike agreed to make the introductions, and within 2 hours Sarah found herself sitting across from Special Agent Patricia Valdez in a conference room at the FBI's Phoenix field office. Agent Valdez was a small woman with intelligent eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen enough criminal enterprises to recognize a solid case when she saw one. Sarah had prepared for this meeting the way she prepared for everything now, methodically and completely. She presented her evidence in organized folders, each section clearly labeled and cross-referenced. Financial records that proved systematic money laundering. Photographs that documented illegal meetings. Business documents that revealed shell companies and fraudulent transactions. Witness statements from employees who had unknowingly participated in criminal activity. Agent Valdez reviewed the materials with growing amazement. "How long did you say you've been working on this?" 8 months. Full-time, in addition to my regular job. "And you're not law enforcement? Not a private investigator?" "I'm a social worker who got very angry and decided to learn some new skills." Agent Valdez smiled for the first time since the meeting began.
"Well, your anger has produced better work than most professional investigators."
"This is enough to bring down Henley's entire network." Sarah leaned forward. "What about my family? My mother, brother, and sister have been manipulated and intimidated into participating in activities they didn't fully understand. They're ready to cooperate fully, but they need protection. Given the quality of your evidence, I think we can work something out. Your family members will need to provide statements and possibly testify, but with immunity agreements and witness protection if necessary." "There's one more thing," Sarah said. "Robert Henley disappeared 3 days ago. He may have realized that his operation was compromised." Agent Valdez's expression grew serious.
Do you know where he went?
"No, but I might be able to find out." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Agent Valdez a tracking application she had installed. "I've been monitoring his financial activity through public record searches. If he uses any credit cards or bank accounts, I'll know where he is. That's stalking. That's research using publicly available information. Everything I've tracked is accessible through legitimate channels if you know what to look for." Agent Valdez studied Sarah with new respect. "You really did learn some new skills." Within hours, the FBI had teams positioned at all of Robert's business locations. Warrants were obtained based on Sarah's evidence, and simultaneous raids were conducted at 6 dealership locations across Arizona. The searches revealed hidden safes full of cash, computers containing encrypted financial records, and documents linking Robert's operation to money laundering networks in Nevada, California, and Texas. Marcus and Elena were brought in for questioning, and Sarah watched through a one-way mirror as her siblings realized the full extent of what they had been involved in. Marcus had managed one of the dealerships where most of the money laundering occurred, but his statements to agents made it clear that he had been following orders without understanding their purpose. Elena had designed marketing materials that were actually coded communication systems for the criminal network, but her computer design background had made her valuable to Robert without her realizing why. Both of her siblings agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, in exchange for immunity deals. They would testify against Robert and provide access to records and communications that would strengthen the federal case. But Robert himself remained missing, and Sarah's financial tracking had gone cold after he abandoned his known credit cards and bank accounts. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jenny Reeves, Sarah's college friend who worked at the newspaper, called with information that changed everything. "Remember how I told you about the late-night meetings at Robert's office building? Well, my boyfriend's security company handles several buildings downtown, and he's been seeing the same pattern at a property management company called Desert Holdings. Same kind of people, same kind of hours, Same kind of activity that doesn't match the business they're supposed to be running. Sarah researched Desert Holdings and discovered that it was one of the shell companies in Robert's network, used to launder money through fake real estate transactions. If Robert was still in Phoenix, he might be using Desert Holdings as a temporary base of operations while he tried to salvage his criminal enterprise. She shared this information with Agent Valdez, who arranged for surveillance of the Desert Holdings office. Within 24 hours, they had confirmation that Robert was indeed using the location as a headquarters for damage control operations. The FBI moved quickly to prevent Robert from destroying evidence or fleeing the country. A coordinated operation involved agents from multiple jurisdictions, financial crime specialists, and computer forensics experts who could recover encrypted data from Robert's systems. Sarah was allowed to observe the arrest from a surveillance van parked across the street from the Desert Holdings office. She watched as federal agents surrounded the building and arrested Robert as he tried to leave through a rear exit. The man who had demanded she burn her father's memory was handcuffed and read his rights, while dozens of law enforcement officers seized computers, files, and records that would complete the case against his criminal network. As Robert was placed in the back of a federal vehicle, he looked across the street and made eye contact with Sarah through the van's tinted windows. Even though she knew he couldn't see her clearly, she felt as though he understood exactly who had brought about his downfall. The woman he had dismissed as an obstacle to his family empire had become the architect of his destruction. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Robert's operation. His dealership network had laundered over $15 million for criminal organizations across the Southwest. He had used legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities, manipulated family members into unknowing participation, and threatened anyone who asked questions about his methods. Sarah's evidence was crucial to securing convictions not just against Robert but against his criminal associates in other states. Her methodical documentation had created an unbreakable chain of evidence that linked dozens of people to money laundering, racketeering, and fraud charges. Marcus and Elena, protected by their immunity agreements, provided testimony that ensured Robert received the maximum sentence allowable under federal guidelines. Carmen, still recovering from her heart episode, gave a victim impact statement that detailed the psychological manipulation and intimidation that had kept her family silent about Robert's crimes. During Robert's sentencing hearing, Sarah sat in the gallery wearing her father's leather jacket. When Robert was given 25 years in federal prison, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. After the hearing, Sarah met her family outside the courthouse. The 8 months of separation had changed all of them. But for the first time since the barbecue that destroyed their relationships, they were standing together. "I don't know how to apologize for what we put you through," Marcus said. "We were scared and stupid, and we let him turn us against you." "You don't need to apologize," Sarah replied. "You need to learn from it. All of us do." Elena stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah, I said horrible things to you. I told you Mum wasn't your mother anymore. I don't know how you can ever forgive me." Sarah looked at her sister, remembering the young woman who had once borrowed her clothes and asked for advice about boys. That woman was still there, underneath the fear and manipulation that Robert had used to control her. "Because that's what family does," Sarah said simply. "We forgive each other and we move forward together." Carmen hugged her daughter tightly, and Sarah could smell the familiar scent of her mother's perfume mixed with hospital disinfectant. It was the first time they had embraced since the day Sarah left her childhood home wearing her father's jacket, and it felt like coming home after a very long journey. As they stood together on the courthouse steps, Sarah realized that the woman who had been thrown away like an old jacket had not only survived her exile, but had used it to become something stronger, smarter, and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. Her transformation was complete, but her story was just beginning. 1 year after Robert's sentencing, Sarah Martinez stood in the conference room of her own private investigation firm, looking out at the Phoenix skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was spectacular, but what gave her the most satisfaction was the knowledge that she had earned every inch of this success through her own determination and skill. Martinez's investigations had grown beyond her wildest expectations. What began as a one-woman operation conducted from her apartment had evolved into a specialized firm that focused on financial crimes, family exploitation cases, and corporate fraud. Sarah had leveraged her experience with the Robert Henley case into a reputation as someone who could uncover truth in the most complex criminal enterprises.
Her first major client had been a woman whose husband was using their family business to launder drug money. Very similar to what Robert had done to Sarah's family.
The case had tested all of Sarah's investigative skills and emotional resilience, but she had successfully gathered evidence that led to the husband's arrest and protected the woman and her children from both criminal charges and physical retaliation. Word spread quickly through Phoenix's legal community that Sarah Martinez could handle cases that other investigators wouldn't touch. She specialized in situations where family relationships were being exploited for criminal purposes, where intimidation and manipulation kept victims silent, and where traditional law enforcement approaches weren't sufficient to protect innocent people caught up in criminal enterprises. The firm now employed 6 full-time investigators, 2 forensic accountants, and a computer specialist who had worked for the FBI before joining Sarah's team. They handled cases across the Southwest, and Sarah had been invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about techniques for investigating family-based financial crimes. But success hadn't changed Sarah's fundamental motivation. She still wore her father's leather jacket to important meetings, still approached each case with the methodical patience he had taught her, and still believed that protecting families from exploitation was the most important work she could do. Her own family had struggled with the aftermath of Robert's criminal enterprise. Marcus had lost his job when the dealerships were seized as criminal assets, but he had used his management experience to find work with a legitimate auto dealership in Tucson. He was slowly rebuilding his career and his reputation, and he called Sarah every week to update her on his progress and ask for advice about handling the stress of starting over. Elena had been hit harder by the scandal. Her marketing work for Robert's network had made her unemployable in Phoenix's advertising industry, where everyone knew about her involvement in the case. She had moved to Denver, where she was working for a non-profit organization that helped victims of financial fraud. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Elena was now using her marketing skills to help people who had suffered through experiences similar to what her own family had endured. Carmen had recovered physically from her heart episode, but the emotional trauma of discovering that she had been married to a criminal had taken longer to heal. She had started therapy and joined a support group for families affected by white-collar crime. She was learning to forgive herself for the choices she had made out of fear, and she was rebuilding her relationship with each of her children. The most meaningful change in Sarah's relationship with her mother was their Sunday tradition. Every week, Carmen came to Sarah's apartment for dinner, and they would spend hours talking about everything they had missed during the 8 months of separation. Carmen would help Sarah cook, and they would share stories and memories that bridged the gap between the family they had been and the family they were becoming. During one of these dinners, Carmen brought a box of their father's belongings that she had saved from Robert's purge. "I hid these in the garage," she explained as Sarah opened the box. "I couldn't let him burn everything." Inside were photographs of their father working on cars, tools he had used in his shop, and a letter he had written to Sarah when she graduated from college. The letter praised her dedication to helping people and predicted that she would find a way to make a real difference in the world. "He would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Carmen said, watching Sarah read the letter with tears in her eyes. "I hope so," Sarah replied. "I did everything I could to honor what he taught me about standing up for what's right." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. Agent Patricia Valdez was calling with an update on a new case that had connections to Robert's criminal network. "Sarah, we've got a situation in Las Vegas that looks familiar. Family-owned business, suspicious financial activity, family members who seem to be in over their heads. The local FBI office specifically requested that we recommend you for the investigation." Sarah looked at her mother, who was smiling with pride despite not understanding the details of the conversation. "Send me the files," Sarah said. "I'll be in Las Vegas tomorrow." After she hung up, Carmen shook her head in amazement. "You know, when Robert made you choose between your father's jacket and staying in the family, he thought he was punishing you."
"He was punishing me," Sarah said.
"But punishment isn't the same thing as defeat." "No," Carmen agreed. "Sometimes punishment is just preparation for something better." The Las Vegas case turned out to be Sarah's most challenging investigation yet. A family construction company was being used to launder money for a drug trafficking organization, and 3 generations of the same family were involved at different levels of awareness and complicity. Sarah spent 6 months carefully documenting the criminal enterprise while working to identify which family members were victims and which were willing participants. The investigation required her to go undercover as a potential business partner, a role that tested all of her investigative skills and required her to maintain false identities for weeks at a time. She had learned to become anyone she needed to be in order to protect the people she was trying to save. The case concluded with the arrest of the family patriarch and 2 of his sons while protecting his daughter and grandchildren from criminal charges. The daughter, who had been manipulated into providing accounting services for the money laundering operation, became one of Sarah's key witnesses, and eventually started her own small business with money recovered from the criminal enterprise. Sarah returned to Phoenix with a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the successful resolution of another case. She was building a reputation as someone who could navigate the complex intersection of family relationships and criminal activity. Someone who understood that not everyone involved in a criminal enterprise was truly criminal. Her success had brought recognition from law enforcement agencies across the country. The FBI had offered her a position as a consultant for financial crimes investigations. The Arizona Attorney General's office had asked her to lead a task force on family-based money laundering operations. Law schools were inviting her to teach courses on investigative techniques. But Sarah's most important recognition came from an unexpected source. She received a letter from Robert Henley, written from federal prison, asking for her forgiveness and acknowledging that his attempt to control her family had created the very person capable of bringing down his criminal empire. "I realize now that you were protecting your family long before I ever came into their lives," he wrote. "Your father raised you to be stronger than I understood, and I should have recognized that strength instead of trying to destroy it. I hope someday you can forgive an old man who confused money with wisdom and control with love." Sarah showed the letter to her mother during one of their Sunday dinners. "Are you going to write back?" Carmen asked. Sarah folded the letter carefully and set it aside. "No. Forgiveness doesn't require communication. I can forgive him for what he did to our family without pretending that we have a relationship to repair." "Your father would say the same thing," Carmen said. "He always believed that forgiveness was something you did for yourself, not for the person who hurt you." That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment wearing her father's leather jacket and looking at the case files for her next investigation. A family in Albuquerque was being extorted by criminals who had discovered that the family's food truck business was struggling with tax debt. The extortionists were offering to help with the family's financial problems in exchange for using the business to launder money from their drug operation. It was exactly the kind of case that had become Sarah's specialty. Criminals targeting vulnerable families, using financial pressure to force compliance with illegal activities, and creating situations where innocent people became unwilling accomplices to serious crimes. Sarah opened her laptop and began planning her approach to the case. She would travel to Albuquerque next week, establish her cover identity, and begin the careful work of documenting the criminal enterprise while identifying ways to protect the family being exploited. As she worked, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. The woman who had been exiled from her family for refusing to burn her father's memory had become someone who made a living protecting other families from similar exploitation. The leather jacket that Robert had ordered her to destroy had become her armor, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Sarah had learned that transformation wasn't just about becoming someone new, it was about discovering who you had always been underneath the expectations and limitations that other people placed on you. She had always been a protector, someone who stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Robert's attempt to change her had simply revealed that strength more clearly. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her planning. It was Marcus, calling for their weekly check-in. "How's business?" he asked, and Sarah could hear the pride in his voice. "Growing," she said. "I'm heading to New Mexico next week for a new case." "Another family in trouble?" "Another family that's going to be okay once they have someone on their side who knows how to fight back." After they hung up, Sarah returned to her case files, working late into the night, as she had every night for the past year. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of her typing and the occasional siren from the street below. In the morning, she would put on her father's leather jacket and go to work protecting another family from predators who thought they could use love and loyalty as weapons. She would gather evidence, build cases, and coordinate with law enforcement agencies to ensure that justice was served and innocent people were protected. It was exactly the kind of work her father had taught her to value. Helping people who needed help, standing up for what was right, and never giving up even when the odds seemed impossible. The woman who had been thrown away had become exactly who she was meant to be, and every morning when she put on that leather jacket, she carried her father's memory into a world that needed both his wisdom and her strength.